Okay, just hoping that I'm assuming I'm audible. We were audible for right now. So, okay. Sport was always supposed to be intended to be a joyful activity, but it could never be in Negative's world. It was never going to be worth playing if these stadiums were built on the back of migrant workers whose remittances and bodies never went back to their home country. Four things in this debate. Firstly, what this looks like. Secondly, why this devastates host nations currently. Thirdly, why we are uniquely able to fix it on side affirmative. And fourthly, why we just get better sport, which is obviously a huge benefit in this debate. Firstly, we want to be crystal clear as to what this looks like. We don't think there is like a universal sports city, like they declare Ouagadougou like the sports city of the world. We don't think that that is a realistic thing. Perhaps they are the designated host of like the African Games. We think that is a totally fair thing for that nation to do, but we do not think it is every single like sport. Secondly, we think that FIFA, Olympics, etc. They would all have their own individual locations. And the third thing to say is they would probably just pick these reasonably well. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The first one is they might have places with existing infrastructure. So, for instance, it was very easy to hold the recent T20 World Cup in Australia because we had a bunch of stadiums that could do that as well. The second, and importantly, of a sport that is played very frequently in this country, it was not like we had to build a bunch. We were still going to use those. The second thing to say is that there's an enormous amount of regulatory approval. You would want to have a stable regime to take this on. And then the third one is they probably, when they were given the choice, would not choose a nation with a horrible human rights record. Firstly, because a lot of the time they just aren't monsters. They will just pick the better option. But and then the second thing is there is a huge amount of backlash. As we saw this week, quite literally the worst PR speech ever given by the FIFA president was, met with like they at best memes, at worst like ridicule for that speech. And the last thing about accessibility, you want somewhere where it's kind of like easier to travel. There's established flight routes, boats, trains, whatever as well. That is probably something that they would prefer as well. So firstly, on why it is absolutely devastating for the host nation, the ones in the status quo. I think two parts of this argument. Firstly, why they do it now, even though it's an irrational choice, and secondly, why these harms accrue. So we're going to preempt some material that we assume is going to come out from side negative. That is like, well, if it's so bad, why do they keep taking it on? The first thing to say is there is an arrogant, optimistic, biased perception that these nations will do this well. Like they'd seen it fail before, but it's like, that's not my country. I am the president of this nation. I'm going to be able to do it well. The second thing is often there is like a sort of like wrong consensus. They're able to example pick times in the future where it was fine. Like if a nation was going to host FIFA, they're like, well, it was fine for South Africa. But then ignoring a bunch of other examples. The last thing to say is also just like the harms of hosting are very unclear at different times. So like the cost of gentrification in Los Angeles, the impact of over-policing in Tokyo, the impact of illegal evictions in Baku for the European Games. Those were things that could not be adequately foreseen in that amount of time. But fourthly, there is like a presumed prestige, right? Firstly, international prestige, but also for the government. Note all of like the rhetoric from the Queensland state government. We're going to bring the Olympics to Brisbane, like all of that material. But this is compounded with regimes that are trying to seek legitimacy, which is exactly what is happening with the FIFA World Cup currently. But importantly, nations that are the most corrupt are the ones that are able to lay down the most amount of money for the bids currently. And so we think that is just like means they're more likely to receive them in the status quo. Whereas if it was over a long period of time, and like all of these organizations knew that was going to be for a long period of time, they needed a stable place or their games wouldn't exist at all, they were likely to make a better choice. So why is this actually just so horrific for these nations? So firstly, a ton of environmental problems, like required construction, things like, water contamination that occurs, transport. This is entirely devastating for these cities. And importantly, it is particularly not worth it if it is a one-time thing as well. The second thing is there is an enormous human cost. As I flagged in my introduction, like as of last year with 6,500 migrant workers, now it is close to 12,000, mostly Indian, Pakistani, and Nepalese nationals. We think that these are really terrible conditions. But importantly, what you're able to do now is even if side negative can prove that they choose nations with like the worst human rights records, we don't multiply that harm every single 4 years for every event that occurs. We're able to limit that contagion of harm. And that is something we can only uniquely bring on side affirmative. But lastly, we think that even in places that have like that have like good human rights records or like better ones, to say. The first one is just like they still feel the need to do things like clean up over. They feel the need to clean up, and they'll do things like over policing, and that is really really harmful. But also, even if they are like a developed nation, they're likely to fuel gentrification. Note, Azerbaijan had two events of this in the 2010s. The first one, although not a sporting event, was the building of the Crystal Hall for the Eurovision Song Contest. Like literally, they had to do thousands of illegal evictions. But then they did it all again. They couldn't use the same hall, and they had to build a bunch of new stadiums for the European Games, which they got a huge amount of backlash on. Olly did a whole segment on the European Games after Azerbaijan, like a huge amount of backlash. They had to build a bunch of other stuff. There haven't really been anything in Azerbaijan since. Obviously, those illegal evictions were not worth it for that country. But why do we actually think it is just like better when you pick one? Observe a lot of the harms I've just described we are able to limit that. We don't inflate that like tag negative does. So the first thing to say is nations have a lot of debt on bids. Firstly, we don't think they see return. But secondly, they probably, because they only host it once, right? Now, when you're able to host many times, you're able to get like some return on that. I like to call this the cost per wear mechanism. You like might buy a really nice shirt, but you know you're going to wear it like 300 times. That is what these nations are literally able to do. You're not doing a one cost per wear on these items. You get a sustainable return. You avoid the multiplication of building that harm, and you also learn how to do it. An example of this occurring in every year would be like, in Milan, they don't build new catwalks for Fashion Week every single year. That would be the same for these games. The last thing to say is like these harms come from inappropriate bids. We think that we limit the amount of inappropriate bids. So we think that we choose nations more wisely. For instance, if you only knew that you could only pick one more meal to eat for the rest of your life, you probably would not pick like chips. You were probably likely to pick a more sort of like well-rounded meal. You were more like maybe you would choose the falafel like halal snack pack. And that would be something that was far better for those individuals, far better for your health, and far better for these host nations. Lastly, on why it's better for sport. I know I made a couple jokes in this speech, but this is like incredibly important. We think that there are so many dangerously non-viable bids that occur in the status quo, and this harm is avoided in our world. Currently, there are competing bids that are done for political and prestige reasons. You get inappropriate bids for a couple of reasons, like terrain that doesn't work for the sport, issues with climate, and regulatory frameworks, and also lastly diseases. A great example of like this occurring was the contest for the next upcoming Winter Olympics. The options they had were Kazakhstan and Beijing. Notably, the one they went with Beijing, that is 2 hours from a snowfield. It was not a particularly good bid that they accepted. But it was done for political and prestige reasons. Obviously, now you would just like pick one of the like many other nations that you hosted the Winter Olympics in, one that was actually going to be good long term. Obviously, something we'd prefer. But we think that this is deeply unsustainable and harms sport for a lot of reasons. Why does this harm sport? Firstly, it's just hard to do like a lot of these sports in certain areas. The other example I'd give is like the excessive winds in Japan for the Olympics that meant that people like couldn't sail or a bunch of the rounds got cancelled. Very harmful because it is very windy in that location in the world. But maybe if you chose a nation that had like sounds and stuff, you would be able to have like less wind coming in. The second thing is athletes cannot compete if they like are subject to things like Zika virus. The last thing is you prevent the unpredictability of bids. You knew where it was, you knew where it was going to be, and you knew that people didn't die to make sure you could play there.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative and welcome up the first negative to open their team's case.
Just checking I'm visible and audible.
You are.
So, 3, 2, 1. Let's make it clear at the start of speech, we defend the status quo. Why do we think the countries these people pick at the start is likely to be particularly bad? We think this is likely to be set in very Western contexts in their world, and that's just because the premium in their world is likely to be one placed on stability compared to the status quo, which is one where you can kind of risk one event in one country, which means you're likely to far more spread this out. So I think this looks like the vast majority of events occur in kind of like in the middle of Europe, it occurs in the US, maybe it occurs in Australia every now and again. I think that's pretty boring. Let's move on. First, why do we think this spending is actually good? And this will obviously directly clash to the first question from this team. Then we'll explain why sports washing doesn't work and why this informs the world of problems. Confused this team didn't run this argument. Then we'll explain a principle of why sport should be shared around. Then we'll deal with the claim why sport is worse under their world. Again, obviously directly responsive. This is why I don't have a separate issues or response. Why is this spending likely to be particularly good? We explain, the first thing is just that any of the problems this team explain are likely to be ones people are well informed of. And that means, like, you know, they know, we know, they know that the debt is likely to be pretty high. You know, it requires a lot of man hours. You know, it's likely to take a long time to pay off and stuff like that. They attempt to assert that people are likely to be particularly irrational and have a positivity bias. No explanation why whole governments are likely to be this. Like, maybe a couple of individuals are likely to have a positivity bias, but a bias is like a very personal thing, and a government is a decidedly non-personal thing, right? Because it's an aggregation of humans, which means there's probably a set of people that are likely to check that irrationality. The second claim they make is that, like, governments do it for the prestige. Good. That means they're likely to announce it early on, which means it's likely to be like a campaign promise. It's likely to be something that people explicitly vote on in an election, which means the people are likely to make that decision. I would note the fact that Bob Katter spends a lot of time critiquing the kind of Queensland government about this decision. It means people know about the trade-offs about running the Commonwealth Games in Queensland, which means I think the voters will make a pretty informed decision if this is good or not. Second, it's just the economic viability of this is deeply hard to measure, which is the affirmative team says you end up in a lot of debt. I think this explains why you're likely to pay off that debt over the long term. And that's because the value of this is obviously not an actuary one. Like you don't just like make all the money directly back in ticket sales or something like that and then say, wow, this is really good for our bottom line as a country. You're likely to get a whole bunch of very long-term benefits, right? Like maybe you run the Olympics in 1 year and then 10 years later you run, like, you know, your national competition there, or you run any other series of much smaller events in this debate that are ones that are not international focused, so don't come under this debate. And there's a whole lot of benefits that occur by having those facilities and being able to facilitate niche sports, or being able to just have a better facility when you go through those things. Maybe it's safer to do those facilities. And I think that's likely to have a series of economic effects that take a very long time to actuate. I think the fact that Sydney still benefits from its good facilities, its good stadiums and stuff like that, I obviously would never have been able to go play in good stadiums if I lived somewhere else, because there would not have been an incentive to do so otherwise. But I think there's just a long-term benefit for the tourism benefits. Plus, you're likely to get a huge amount of money first when tourists show up. These people are likely to be incredibly cash heavy, and they're likely to be willing to spend high because there's norms around the fact that there's lots and lots of people coming to the Olympics or the World Cup or something like that. They're willing to pay a lot. But even then, if they're not willing to pay a lot in the short term and they are willing to be gouged, you're likely to just be able to advertise your country favorably. And I think this team kind of concedes this. And that means you're likely to have like TV media fill in the gaps in the broadcast with good pictures of your tourist locations or something like that. Which means, again, the long-term benefits of this is particularly good for your country, which I think explains why countries are likely to opt into making these decisions and making these bids in situations where they already were planning by big infrastructure plans. And this was part of it. They were already doing tourist push, and this is part of it. And this is just a way to capitalize on it. So I think they're likely to be well aware of the problems. It's likely to pay off in the very long term. And they're likely to just have like kind of probably pretty smart economics people figure out the long-term benefits and how many people, additional people they need each year to come as tourists or something like that over the next 5 years to make this actually viable. I don't think if I can conceptualize how that economics works, I think the fucking whole countries can. Second is just to point out that these investments are very good in direct jobs. You hire a huge amount of kind of semi-skilled, very middle-class workers in these countries, which is generally incredibly good because they have very high propensities to spend, which is incredibly good for the rest of the economy. These jobs are likely to be particularly useful then. Also, there's a set of people that need to just facilitate the events themselves, which gives a set of people that otherwise might not have that experience, a lot of experience. And even if they don't, it's a very translatable skill if you go to a different country or go to a different part of the country. So prestige is likely to be helped on those things. Helps a lot of poor people because those jobs are likely to be pretty menial. So this is likely to help society generally about this. There's a whole bunch of social benefits, just like a whole bunch of nationalism that occurs. Far more likely to support your government because you're like, wow, my government was capable of achieving something. There was something that brought us all together, which means you're less likely to have kind of disruptions in the society, it's more likely to have a coercive society, which also has very hard to measure economic benefits, but ones these states are likely to measure and likely to measure particularly well. What other claims does this team make? First, they claim that it's likely to be bad for the environment because you're likely to place these stadiums in kind of bad places or something like that. I think you can probably figure this out. Second, they don't actually articulate what those environmental harms. I'm sure they will later on in the debate. The other two claims they have is, well, now you spend a lot of money on transport. I think that explains why you're likely to over-facilitate, which means you'll end up having very good transport systems when your population population returns, I think the fact that there's very good transport systems in these countries is probably very good for the economy broadly. If everyone can save 10, 15 minutes off their commute, that makes people far happier and their productivity far higher. Then they claim that you're likely to over police by pushing people out of areas or enforcing homeless problems or something like that. I think the problem is this is likely to occur regularly in the context where you set up this new the Olympic city or the World Cup city, which means I think you continue to punish someone every couple of years versus you spread out that harm. It's probably regrettable. These guys will have another response to this, but I think this is a harm we'd rather share around and make everyone cop it once in their lifetime. If you say a homeless person in Sydney, rather than forcing someone to deal with it every 2 years if you're homeless in a particular Olympic city. Let's explain why this is likely to inform people of these countries' problems or generally just inform the people of the world better. First is just to point out, investigative journalists, especially Western ones, are incredibly good at getting around government censorship and blocking. They're very crafty. They don't have a lot of experience in this, and they're likely to go to lots of different contexts to see all the different techniques that apply. Comparatively, the countries that are likely to enforce bans, like Qatar right now in the World Cup, are particularly bad at enforcing this because they have blanket bans. They're not very good at censorship because they just do it so broadly and they do it so much only to their domestic population. It means when you have international journalists, which you have to allow you to promote your sport, these people are likely to find out things about your country. And this has just led to us knowing more about, say, the favelas in Brazil and the slums there, the kafala, I'm sorry if I can't say that right, visas in Qatar. We know far more about South African crime because of the journalism that occurs in those things. I wouldn't know any of those things about those countries otherwise, and that just means people understand the problems that occur in these contexts, put pressure on these people to do it. But even if you don't put pressure, there's just awareness there are problems in these countries. People are likely to be more sympathetic to the average South African they meet on the street or something like that. I think that means the interest in these contexts and the clicks you get from it, an investigative journalist, is far higher. You know more about the problems in the world. But importantly, this is leverage against these countries because, as I explained, you're likely to start this as a tourism push more generally. It means you have huge sunk costs. And then when you realize people aren't buying enough flights or enough tickets to your stadium because they're like, man, we figured out your country has really fucked human rights or something like that, you likely have to change your human rights to be able to make sure that these people come along. And journalism is likely to point out that you can't have shallow changes. They won't facilitate people. People won't be happy enough. And anyway, even if you have small changes, it likely signals to local activists that you can achieve change, and now they have a platform to talk about it. So I think this just explains why the context I explained, the slums in Brazil, the migrant workers situation in Qatar is better and will continue to get better because of these games. Finally, this is deeply unfair because sports is meant to be an international activity. That's the very point of the modern Olympics. We entrench the fact that this goes to the most Western and stable countries in the status quo. I think this means people are likely to be far more pissed off about the sport, which is the final claim. That is, whoever has the home ground advantage and the person that makes a huge amount of profit from hosting this game every year, every couple of years, flipping their benefit, is likely to be a context where they always win the games, which means people buy into it less because they're frustrated it's not a fair competition, which leads to situations where people care less about the game, less people dignities go along, there's less diplomacy that occurs on the sidelines of these events. I think this ruins sport. It definitely is good for knowing about these countries, and I think the economic benefits actually are pretty clear. Very proud.
I'd like to thank First Negative and welcome up to Second Affirmative to continue their team's case.
Just making sure I can be heard.
You are audible.
Two extraneous observations before I begin the speech in earnest. The first is on investigative journalism and overall awareness of the kind of issues that take place in these countries. Not to pick on Tom too much here, but he can't even pronounce the word favela, let alone, I think, articulate exactly what goes on in them, because the Olympics were hosted there, quite some 6 years ago. And I think probably under the status quo, they said even if there are investigative journalistic pieces now, even if there is media coverage now, as soon as that sporting event ends and moves on to the next city and moves on to the future of that sport, that criticism, that critique
speak, though the global eyes that are directed towards that staging ground divert, and they go to something else in an increasingly fast-paced media cycle that exists globally now, and it's consistently competing for people's attention. I do not think that is an affirmative benefit. The second thing, though, is on Tom's ability to play sport in Sydney on good facilities. People still have a demand to play sport. When we tell you that the facilities still exist in our world, it is for that reason, and it is better because a lot of the time that the reason that those sports facilities exist is because there is an organic and local demand to play those sports. There is a cultural significance of those sports, and that means that those sporting facilities do not, as they did in Brazil, become dilapidated hellscapes for urbex nuts to go in and look at a mere 6 years after one of the largest Olympic Games in the world was held there. Obviously, the benefits of being a host city just do not stack up, and people continue to make bad decisions. That does not preclude us from winning this debate by protecting them from making those decisions there. Let's firstly talk about why the picking of the city itself and this kind of process is going to be executed relatively well. I'll firstly direct you to the comparative, because I think you guys are a little too glib about 12,000 dead migrant workers. I think they're a little too glib about enormous amounts of neighborhoods, even in the developed world, even in Sydney, even in Tokyo, even in Los Angeles, being completely displacing enormous amounts of local people, completely gentrifying enormous swaths of that city, and these countries aggressively over-policing minority communities there to clean up their international image. Something these guys say is a benefit, that is propagandistic. That is the kind of thing that these governments do when they have international eyes on them for a very, very short window of time to capitalize on. We tell you that is bad. We tell you that the way that they're currently selected is usually who can throw the most money at the problem. So that is who has the most unilateral authority to go into massive amounts of debt without needing popular consensus. So it is governments like Brazil in the case of the Olympics. It is governments like Qatar in the case of the FIFA World Cup, who because they can take out enormous amounts of debt, they access enormous line of credit against enormous amounts of assets that do not require the assent of people in those countries, or they do require the assent of people in those countries. The very rhetoric that is used by this team, that where the economic benefits simply do not stack up, is enough often to persuade them. People who are not particularly literate when it comes to the kind of long-term implications taking out debt to build a massive stadium for which there is no local organic demand in the majority of cases. You cannot point to Sydney, one instance where we still used our Olympic Park, and not also pointing to the dilapidated Olympic diving pools in Brazil, which now exist, despite there presumably being people in Brazil who like to swim. Obviously, the kind of demand that we're talking about of an international major sporting event and the kind of regular demand of sport is insane. Why will these cities be chosen well with the material that they don't really deal with from Aleisha? What do they say? They firstly say this will not be chosen well because they'll choose Western countries based on stability. Good. That doesn't necessarily mean all of the host cities that are chosen are in the West. For instance, the FIFA backup city, I believe, is in South Africa. There are obviously viable locations throughout Asia. There are places outside the West that are stable and developed, guys. But note, stability and risk, and those words in this instance are really convenient euphemisms. Stability being a euphemism for a continued stream of income into the future and predictability, so you can have workers there without needing to exploit them. So you do not need to build a stadium in a couple of years and massively exploit people who are looking for businesses or risk. When you talk about dead migrant workers, when you talk about the risk of legitimizing regimes with terrible human rights records, look past the veneer of the language they're using and look into the real world of these examples. This is done terribly under the status quo. The second reason, and that economic devastation, all the things I've already talked to you about. The second reason is that choosing a city, which is probably already itself a pretty suitable candidate. It has a stadium, it has some infrastructure, it can accommodate large swells of people in its economy, it has kind of those dedicated facilities, or is able to stick a one-time cost into making those things with the expectation that every period they will be used for that particular purpose, makes it a good city, right? That is the point at which they're able to accommodate in the long term the expectation that this will routinely happen to them. That is actually better than displacing an entire community of people to build an Olympic village every 4 years. It's just having an Olympic village that is probably used as some form of temporary accommodation in the interim and is then used as an Olympic village 4 years later. That is obviously better. I don't know why they think that somebody being homeless in Sydney and then someone being homeless in a different city 4 years later would be better than one person not being homeless at all, because that person wasn't forced out of their home because they didn't need to be. The facilities already existed because they're a permanent host location. That is nutty. Secondly, in this speech then, will these economic benefits occur? These guys have a pot of gold over here, and they have a set of rotating games here. And then they say that there is a rainbow between them, but I will tell you simply that that rainbow does not exist. They do not get this benefit. This economic benefit is either the pipe dream that is sold to populations when their ascent is required, or more frequently, as we tell you at Aleisha, used to for instance, placate populations whose assent is ultimately not required in despotic regimes, for instance, or used to flex on your internal political opposition, as was done in Brazil and many other countries as well. Or thirdly, used to internationally strongman and build up legitimacy for your regime that is probably despotic and probably awful and covering up a bunch of human rights violations. It is in almost all instances just a pipe dream. What do they say? Well, why do they not get these benefits? The first thing is, when we come to spending, this kind of spending, be it with the injection of capital to build stadiums, or be it like the accommodation, the transport, and all of those things, is bad because it is associated with a one-off form of demand that will never ever be matched again. They say, yes, we will match the level of demand in 10 years' time. 10 years? You're going to gentrify an entire community for a speculative benefit? 10 years? Future? Are you kidding me? That is an insane amount of time to completely rip apart the fabric of communities in these cities, completely economically devastate local businesses. That is insane. What this actually does is it saddles these countries with enormous amounts of debt that they had to take out because they did not have the liquidity to build these things in the first place in the overwhelming majority of instances. But secondly, it does not often attract future demand, which is why almost all of the Olympic facilities in Brazil are dilapidated and are completely abandoned now. There was the hope that they would host future sporting events, and they didn't in the overwhelming majority of instances. Secondly, though, the spending that is conducted, I guess, by money changing hands, by workers coming in, by people coming in spending money, is also, one-off, short-term, inorganic with respect to the rest of the economy. Because a lot of the time, just go straight to MNCs who operate the vendors, the accommodation, the ticket sales, even the beer that they're giving people 7 miles away from the stadium in Qatar right now. But secondly, a lot of the time, the people who are paying are temporary workers who never ever spend any more money in that community again. At least now, maybe you have a predictable workforce that comes back every year. You have a predictable set of people who works in that industry. Lastly, and thirdly, then, on despotic regimes, which, as we tell you, are an enormous quantity of this debate on the, spectrum of how despotic your government is, from, the Brazils of the world to the Qatars of the world. They get often enormous amounts of legitimacy from hosting these games. And they often, as these guys seem to concede, direct an enormous amount of propagandic effort to build up nationalism and clean up the image of their country so that people will still go there and buy beers and will drink those beers that they can still get even though they're under Sharia law, on top of the graves of 12,000 dead migrant workers. Do not let this team run away from the debate. That is the world that they have to defend, never ever prouder to affirm.
I'd like to thank Second Affirmative for their speech and welcome up to Second Negative to continue their team's case.
Just confirming that I can be heard and seen.
Yep.
Great. For a team that wants to talk about migrant workers as much as this team does, they do not respond to the harm that we give you, because you cannot have possibly listened to that Second Affirmative speech and believe that Qatar is more legitimized, more supported by the international community now than it was before FIFA brought all of the attention that it did to the migrant workers that existed in Qatar well before the FIFA World Cup, and that continue to exist in it afterwards, but thankfully exist in far more liberalized and far more supportive conditions after FIFA, because FIFA was the impetus that caused the unwinding of the kafala visa system, which has endured in the Gulf countries ever since colonialism for over 50 years, with not a single reform until this year. That is monumental. That happens in many different countries on our side as the benefit of that attention is rotated around the world. And that is a huge benefit for those workers who remain in these countries either way, who are used to do huge infrastructure projects either way, but who now get the benefit of Western attention upon them and and that Western attention promotes reform and better conditions on our side. Let's talk very briefly about who gets this. The important thing to say here is that the harms that we give you at Tom do not rely upon it being like overwhelmingly Western countries. I don't really think that these guys do much to suggest it wouldn't be, though, because I think it is probably pretty likely that if nothing else, these are located in largely Europe, largely potentially you might have some in Southeast Asia, potentially you might have actually some in places like Qatar or Saudi Arabia, which are politically stable travel hubs that have large amounts of infrastructure, which would, I guess, lock in the harms that this team talks about forever. But what is important here is two things. The first one is that when you lock it into one city, that city likely becomes something like an eternal monarch city of that state that draws resources away from other disprivileged areas, and that state can use to legitimize itself in a far more powerful way, because that becomes the only place within that country that gets any sort of attention, and it gets that attention drawn to it repeatedly over a long time period. So there is no incentive whatsoever to care about other areas, and you can constantly use that as a legitimizing tool that is unique and eternal on their side. That comes at the cost of other areas of these countries. That is a harm in even places like the West and even places like Europe, where rural people often are disprivileged, often are deprived of opportunities, often are deprived of even basic infrastructure, and that is incredibly bad. But the second thing to talk about, though, is that this directly contradicts the principles that we give you at Tom's speech to no response about what sports should be, and in particular what international sports should be. Because international sports should be about promoting unity. They should be a level playing field where the developed world and the developing world are able to compete against each other freely and competitively and enthusiastically. But this team locks in home ground advantages, and they allow these states to leverage that to fund their own sporting teams, to give them that home ground advantage, to allow them to play in these stadiums, which means that on their side, they lock in a perception of unfairness, which means that sport loses its tool as a its role as a unifying tool where people come together and compete on equal playing fields. And instead, they turn sport into a weapon that can be used by these relatively more privileged states, whether they are Western or not Western. You have to concede that they're relatively wealthier and relatively more privileged, to use against those that are disprivileged. And I think that that is a world that loses out on significant diplomatic benefits. That is a world where you are unlikely to see things like the Israel-Palestine AFL team, which is a product of Australian outreach and Australian attempts to grow the sport of AFL overseas about 15 years ago. That is kind of a goofy quirk of history, but it probably does matter and it probably does help. And the second thing that you lose out on is probably more like, I guess, well-known things like the South Korean, North Korean joint team in the last Olympics. Because at the point where maybe South Korea is the eternal host of something, or just where another country is the eternal host, those countries all feel less inclined to engage in those sports because they feel like the unfairness is locked in and they cannot compete because they consistently are likely to lose and be outmatched on funding because they have to bear the cost every year of having to travel to these areas, and their money and such is taken by these other countries that get the permanent privilege of hosting these things. That makes sport divisive. That makes sport oppressive. That is not the type of thing that we stand behind on our side. And obviously, this is just an unjust restriction on the freedom of these associations, because these associations often do really positively seek to grow these sports in other places or to respond to things like demographic shifts. For example, the ICC is trying very hard to grow cricket in the United States in order to tap into huge waves of South Asian migration within that country. That's a good thing because it means that those South Asian migrants are able to retain parts of their culture and have access to it. That's valuable for them, and it legitimizes that culture in the broader context of the United States. It means that more Americans know what this sport is about and can talk to these groups about it. It means that you have better unity and you bring people together and you're able to respond to those shifts and to make sure that people can continue to have access to incredibly powerful sporting and cultural events that they care about having access to. That really, really matters. And that means that you have communities being brought together and you have the ability for people to have access to national pride. The other useful example here is that countries often just change around the types of sports that they value. Like India used to be a massive field hockey hub because field hockey was the sport in the Olympics that they got their first ever gold medal in. And immediately afterwards, India was like, field hockey is now our national sport. And in fact, it is still actually technically the national sport of India, funnily enough, because of that legacy. That was important because in the immediate aftermath, India was able to access things like the World Field Cup Championships. And that really mattered towards giving people a sense of national pride. It's making them feel like they could, in this realm at least, fight back against the West, fight back against their oppressors, beat them on the fucking sporting field. That gives you a sense of national pride, and it stabilizes politics in a way that is powerful because people buy into the government more when sports do well and when they have a sense of national pride and identity that comes from access to things like that. That is unbelievably powerful. The last thing to talk about, though, is that when it comes to the economics, I just don't think that this team knows more than the governments of the countries that consistently bid for them, because they can make general arguments about why these are often bad investments, but in some circumstances, they're good ones. For example, it is important that Qatar is able to use the FIFA World Cup to spark off what should be a massive tourism campaign, and it has to liberalize now in order to access that benefit. That is a good thing, because to the extent that states mistakenly believe that they can suppress their poor human rights record and can capitalize and get a huge swell of tourism over the next 5 years that subsidizes the infrastructure improvements in the stadiums that they build, now when they realize that they could not successfully suppress that journalism, and Tom explains why they often make that calculation incorrectly on their side, they are forced to liberalize. They're forced to improve conditions for women and queer people and migrant workers in order to actually get that tourism that they're depending on. That matters tremendously in the context of the Gulf in particular, because the Gulf states are trying very hard to diversify into things like tourist hubs. That's why Qatar is so into sports right now, because they recognize that oil cannot be their source of revenue forever. And if they relied on it exclusively, they'd be about to go bankrupt, and they'd likely face huge amounts of political turmoil as a result, which means that they have a strong incentive to use this in this way, and that forces them to liberalize afterwards. That is incredibly powerful, both for the economic benefits of these countries and the people within them that we should care about, but also, obviously, it is powerful for improving the conditions. Let's talk about that finally, because this opposition team has to understand that this is an unbelievably powerful tool for improving the plight of people who are the most disprivileged. The Qatar example is a fantastic one. The fact that people like us know about these workers dying is very meaningful, but also means that you have a tremendous amount of access for local activists who can now go on things like international news, because those news crews are brought into these countries by these sports that bring the attention to it. It means that local activists, like the people who oppose gentrification in Los Angeles, like the people who oppose destruction of the favelas in Brazil, like the migrant workers and their advocates in the Gulf countries, can actually get on international news, can actually penetrate through to people in Australia like us who are at this debating competition. That is unbelievably meaningful, and that does mean that the rest of the world is aware of these things, and awareness comes before any pressure is possible to reform. That matters dramatically. The last thing to say, though, is that often the harm that is inflicted by these things is not particularly unique, because if it was not the World Cup, Qatar would be building some other huge tourist facility in order to try to diversify its economy, and it would be doing that in the dark, in secret, without attention being drawn to it, and it would be exploiting these workers just as dramatically in that side, probably in a way that was worse. So for those reasons, we improve the conditions of human rights, we make sure that international sport does what it is meant to do, and we give people access to tremendous cultural and human rights benefits.
I'd like to thank second negative for that speech, and welcome up third affirmative to close the substantive portion of today's affirmative team. I've buggered that up, but you guys know what I'm saying. Welcome third affirmative.
I'll ask 3 questions in the speech. Firstly, whether this will be good for host countries economically. Secondly, whether it will be good for them politically. And thirdly, whether it will be good for sport. But I just want to know, they have no response to our worst case. We say corrupt countries will bid to host games they cannot afford. Those corrupt countries have inhuman human rights records, and they kill tens of thousands of workers. And the claim here is just this media scrutiny. There was media scrutiny in Beijing. There was media scrutiny in Brazil. There was media scrutiny in Brazil again. There was media scrutiny for Qatar. Nothing changed. There's been 20 years of migrant workers being killed. In fact, the worst atrocity we saw recently in Qatar. Those people die. They do nothing to stop those people dying. Weigh that harm in this debate. The 3 questions then. Firstly, will this be good for host countries economically? I will first want to defend our world. They say that these games will be hosted in Western countries. That is good. They are rich and they have requirements to treat their workers humanely. That is a good thing. They say then that because, these games still have to be hosted in a country once every 4 years, that still has some problems that are symmetric. Firstly, there are very, very few of those symmetric problems because you have a good economy. You have to treat your workers well. You're not going to go into enormous amounts of debt. It's probably profitable for you to do this because you can keep doing it year after year after year. You have good conditions. But secondly, on that symmetric harm of over-policing, you can only displace a person once. You can only build a stadium over where they live once. They can't move back to it. They have to do that again and again and again and again in every single city that exists. People will know in future this area will be over-policed. That harm does not replicate. So the question you should ask under this issue is actually a far simpler one, which is just, does the status quo where countries host these games do more harm or more good for these countries? Let's engage in that. What do they say? They say that firstly, these countries will kind of choose well. And they say governments are not irrational. They won't host games if they can't. But we explain that there is a huge amount of prestige associated with hosting these games. And the logic here is just like, you want to win an election. Elections are hosted every 4 years in a lot of countries. You have short-termist incentives. People care about sport, so you will host this game as an electoral promise that will make you very popular. And they respond, well, this is in fact a good thing because people get to vote on whether or not that this sporting games will happen in their country. But just think now the irrational argumentation applies, because just think how irrational that particular electorate will be. Like, they're politically and economically illiterate in most cases. It's unlikely they'll be able to understand the long-term economic consequences that this negative team believes they understand so well. But also, they are just fanatical. Like, for a large number of people, sport is the most important thing in their entire life. Why is it that they would ever vote against a proposal to being the most important sporting game of their entire year through their particular country? Which means they will not, in fact, pick well. Governments will have incentives to sell this to populations to win elections, and that population will cling onto it for dear life, which means they will not, in fact, do this well. That was our logic they never even responded to. Now so that having been established, and that doesn't get them away from this debate, I want to respond to kind of all their mechanisms on why this will, economically benefit these countries. The first thing they say is tourism. Firstly, this tourism will be concentrated in incredibly rich areas of the city they go to. In fact, they will probably be staying at hotels that Western transnational corporations set up. Like, the fucking Four Seasons has a hotel for most tourists that go to Rio de Janeiro in the first place. You are afraid of crime in other areas of the city, which means you're not like walking around into the slums and favelas of Brazil and sprinkling money out. You're staying in a concentrated city center where Western corporations exist and giving money to them. This is not good. But secondly, it is a one-time injection. And they say, well, maybe some cities will be able to host these games twice. There are only 10 countries in history that have hosted the Olympics twice. All of them were like London and incredibly rich European countries. And even if you do get to host these games twice, it is still just twice. It is still just 1 month, a decade separated, where you get like 1,000 more tourists coming to your country. Unclear why this is actually that big an impact. Then they talk about employment. Firstly, the richer individuals will get the good managerial jobs in these countries. You're actually giving good quality jobs to poor people. Secondly, Connor explains these jobs are incredibly temporary. Like, you'd have to leave your old job and go to this new job, unclear benefit. And thirdly, in fact, we just proved this is a harm, because the jobs that are being given out, as we have explained to just the response of media PR, are jobs that have been given to people who die. They're construction jobs that cause their death. This is obviously quite an enormous harm. Employment is not the benefit they think it is. Their final and maybe best claim is on infrastructure. Firstly, this infrastructure will be wasted. It is mostly a stadium. But even if you do not believe it is a stadium, it's like roads and transportation. That transportation goes to the stadium. It does not go to the business district. It does not go to the suburbs. It does not increase transportation for those people. It goes straight to the stadium where people watch the games. Unclear that is a good thing. And secondly, in fact, this harm could just be flipped, because you are paving over residential buildings, local businesses, like things that happen. Like, if you want to build a stadium in your CBD, because it's where everywhere in the city leads to, you're paving over an incredibly economically vital area for you. You're like, this infrastructure is ineffective or harmful. Compare that then, so I've provided all the harms the benefits economically to this country that they have provided, to our harms, which they have not charitably engaged with whatsoever. We have proven that governments will make bad decisions, and when governments make bad decisions, they will go into debt. They will spend a lot of money they could otherwise have spent on other things that would have benefited that country, and there will be long-term economic harms. They have not even bothered to rebut those things. They have just said tourism. We've won that issue. Secondly, on the political harms or impacts to a particular country, they say this will bring media scrutiny. Media scrutiny is the exact reason that Brazil forced people out of favelas, because they did not want them to know that in Rio de Janeiro, there was a huge homeless population that were in poverty. That is the harm that it creates. They do not want the international media to know that their country is bad, to understand how awful the conditions are, which is the reason why you do displace people, why you do gentrify particular areas. That was in fact our harm. So compare that harm to their benefit of knowledge, just like knowledge of the harms that happen in these particular countries and the human rights abuses. Firstly, we empirically know that never changes anything. I would invite the negative team to point to a single example. It happened in Shanghai and Beijing. It happened in Brazil, and it happened even worse in Qatar. Why didn't the media scrutiny solve that? It does not do anything. And the reason for that structurally is that you don't just fix poverty in Brazil because for a month Fox News and CNN are going to say, yo guys, there's poverty in Rio de Janeiro. There are structural reasons why that poverty exists. There are no actual reason to fix that. So you should care about more the short-term harms of that media scrutiny displacing people than the long-term reform they think they'll get. Then they finally talk about national pride. I just think like this will be worse, and you'll feel a long-term legacy of shame if you actually go bankrupt after that. But also, you don't actually see the games. Only rich people in that country see the games. You're outpriced by those people, all the Western tourists that go to those games. And also, just like it leaves a legacy of harm and devastation. Like Brazil hosted the World Cup, it then lost 7-1 to Germany. Did that really foster national pride? Unclear. It seems like a pretty risky investment. Finally, on sport, they say that you'll have more incentive to grow sport elsewhere when you have to host it in different countries, but that is actually symmetric. There's still the incentive to grow sport elsewhere because there's a marketing incentive about making more profit and having more athletes compete and having more sponsors and having more viewers, having more money. That is still a symmetric incentive. The bigger claim that they put more time into is the one about equitability. But in fact, I want to flip this. You now know that the Olympics will be hosted in LA in the summer every single year, every 4 years, which means you can prepare those exact climactic conditions. Under this other world, you do not know where the Olympics will be. You cannot train over long periods of time for that particular climactic conditions, which means when you're from a poor country who will never host those games, you never get the benefit of actually preparing in those particular climactic environments. In this world, you can at least train and prepare yourself those conditions if you know them in advance. Then they say the USA will have an advantage if it hosts these, if it hosts these games, but not everyone in the USA like lives in the climactic conditions of Los Angeles. You can just like the Los Angeles will probably have to set up incredibly good training grounds for the people that go into their country and visit that country in the first place. I have truly enjoyed throughout this debate looking at the faces of ANU1 as they laugh as I make every single point that I've made. Probably a bit rude, but very proud to affirm. I think we've won quite clearly.
I'd like to thank Third F for that speech and welcome up Third and Egg.
Cool. Can I be heard?
You can indeed.
Awesome. I'm going to start talking with this speech talking about economics. Then I'll go into the political harms that AF hangs their case on. Finally, I'm going to talk about sport, which I would note that Aleisha weighs super highly in her speech. So it probably does matter in this debate that it almost totally collapses within the next 20 years. Okay, firstly, in terms of economics, the push we get from the affirmative team in this debate is that countries have an optimism bias, which means they are unlikely to be able to assess these things correctly. I think as well, note that a lot of this argument relies on these countries' governments being corrupt, which I think is perhaps true for like some instances in which major sporting events have been held, but probably isn't true for the vast majority of them. And we have a couple of responses to this. The first thing to note is that countries go into debt first before they see the benefits of it. So they're probably likely to be relatively risk averse if they think there's a possibility they don't make it back. They probably want to make sure on this. Secondly, though, most countries are likely to do things like reach out to consulting firms because apparently governments do that. And get them to actually give them proper, detailed descriptions of how likely it is to actually go into the future. Like before you make this big commitment, you're likely to do some level of research. And if that research tells you it's going to be a bad idea, you likely follow through with it because of course it's a lot of money. The third thing to note here though, is a lot of the countries who would do this for the Olympics are likely to look at having a big infrastructure injection for like purposes of tourism, or they want to have a tourism anyway, and they'd find other ways to do this alternatively from the Olympics. So for example, like trying to build big buildings or like other forms of infrastructure or trying to host other major events. So it's just not clear why this is like uniquely bad for sports here. The thing that Bennett tells you is, people will vote silly. Like they won't understand because sport means so much to them. I would note that this, and what Tom says in his speech, which isn't responsive to whatsoever, is that if you're kind of having an election on this sort of issue, the opposition can call you out. And yes, sport might be close to people's heart. You know what else is close to people's heart? Like issues of money. And I think they're often very effective in electoral campaigns. So if the opposition party is saying this is a total like stupid spending of money, we're going to go into so much debt, people likely won't vote for it if they don't feel that it's important to them. Countries are unlikely to do this if it is harmful to them. But I also think, and what we prove is it isn't just not harmful to them in a vast majority of instances. We give you a wide range of benefits. The first is the short-term injection that comes with a massive amount of construction in your country, which maybe is bad in Qatar, but is good in the vast majority of instances where major sports events are held. The second is the longer term that actually occur when the major sports event occurs. Stuff like national tourism. They're like, oh, well, you only get tourism in the rich area of the city. Because you feel it's unsafe, perhaps you use a local tour guide, which is an injection again into the local economy. You also probably do spend money on local food wherever you go within that country. It's also national tourism that occurs in the long term, right? When they put up the lovely pictures of your city on the screens of people all around the world, they view it as a place they want to go, and that tourism benefit increases for the future. We also tell you about money you get from things like TV revenue, which is massive because so many people around the world tune into things. It's also things like being able to hold other international games that require less of a short-term investment, right? So if you hold the Olympics one year, you then have if you hold FIFA one year, the Olympics one year, you then have massive sporting complexes that you can use to hold hold world championships of every other sport in the world. You can use it to start helping you for a bid for the World Cup or something like that, which means you can also get long-term tourism benefits from that over the future. Finally, we tell you it helps with your sports development domestically. Like maybe in Brazil, people don't get the benefits of the diving stadium because that's not a super strong program, but they probably do get the benefits of having very, very good facilities for every other sport that they play in the world, including like good soccer pitches and stuff like that, which improves their ability to succeed in the future. But the third thing to note is the soft benefit that countries get that it also helps them economically, right? Stuff like building transport in the major city where you hold the Olympics means that people are more efficient in the future and your cities work better. Stuff like soft power that you get from holding a major thing like this when it is successful. So like, you know, before China was evil and everything like that, Beijing 2008 was incredibly useful in making China cool again and making people want to have the little mascots that all the kindergarten kids had on their bags and stuff like that. But thirdly, I do think that like cleaning up the environment can sometimes be a great thing. Like I imagine when Brisbane hosts the Olympics in 2032, they'll do something about that stinking Brisbane River that is currently literally brown, and you fix the environmental problem because you want people to see it positively. I'll deal with the political harms next, but I do think there are benefits to the environment here. The fourth thing they say is like, oh, well, we'll talk about like, you know, countries go into debt for this. Note they never prove why debt is bad in this debate, and they probably have to do it for it to be a meaningful harm. Obviously, most countries in the world are in debt right now, and they're not like, you know, really suffering from it. But I would also note that they don't actually talk about a single country that's been fucked by holding the Olympics. Like they suggest that some aspects of the Rio Olympic complex are now unused, but that does not speak to Brazil overall holding the Olympics or the FIFA World Cup being a failure. I think that just illustrates that in most countries, even if they don't make back the economic investment fully, they like bridge that gap by perceiving themselves to be in a stronger position on the international stage and gain other benefits from that they think are important. Okay. Now on the political arguments, Connor's point is essentially people forget about critique about politics over time. That's why Tom mispronounced his word. And when I was laughing while writing that speech, I was actually just making fun of Tom for not being able to pronounce favelas, right? But I actually think they need to be comparative in this debate, because the comparative here is that people care about it at all. That journalists are allowed access into these countries to talk about issues that they haven't been able to before. And notably, that people in the West actually give a shit. Like you don't usually, like many Western people probably don't usually care about the issue of queer rights or women's rights or the kafala visas in Qatar right now, but they do right now because it matters and it's because relevant to an issue they are consuming, which means that we actually have access to this information in a way we never do before. Notably, here in contest with what Bennett says, that media scrutiny is bad because it causes a problem, the intense criticism for a short-term period is actually great. They said that we hadn't named an example. We talked about the rollback of the kafala visas in Qatar, which is occurring right now, which means migrant workers in Qatar can now retain their passports instead of having to give them away to their employer, and can change jobs in Qatar. And note that benefits not just people working in construction, but also a lot of people who work in Qatar on things like being household workers for many rich Western expats there. So it's a massive, massive benefit. But notably, it also signals to other countries in the region that these are unpopular, right? So every other Gulf state who also has a similar kafala system now sees that if they want to make a run at a tourism program like Qatar is doing right now, they need to get rid of this before they start it, meaning they are also likely to take on these reforms in the future. Even if people forget in the long term, we get these changes in the short term now. We can give you clear examples of that is much better than they can do for the economics. Now talking about cleaning up image, right? I think it is just important to note that a lot of the harms they talk to you about are consistent and symmetric. Like, yes, maybe you only build a big motorway somewhere or a big stadium over someplace once, but you do have to get rid of the homeless people from the areas you're hosting every single time you host this. So it does seem to be a relatively consistent problem that one country would have to deal with. But also, I think notably, the pattern of criticism that we are seeing in the status quo makes countries less likely to do things in the future. So now that countries are being consistently criticized for, say, I don't know, problems of gentrification, they are more aware of it in the future and likely to do things better. I also just think their idea of legitimacy, again, is stupid because Qatar is not being legitimized right now. But even their alternatives, like the US government, like legitimizing the US government probably isn't great anyway, and like any other alternatives are not much better. The stuff about death of migrants as well seems bad, but is probably, again, less likely than they want you to believe, right? That is, most countries do not have these terrible situations because of things like strikes occurring or because of the reputational harms that might occur immediately before the games. Countries being concerned that games might be removed from them and moved to another country if it is clear that it is too unstable or if they've done too many harms here. And notably as well, migrant workers will likely be screwed over in other ways in Qatar as well. I point to the fact that migrants were used to do the manual labor for the Burj Khalifa in Dubai and all of the artificial islands that they built in order to, like, you know, increase their position as a tourism state, to mean that, like, if Qatar really wanted to drive tourism, they would probably find other ways to do it. And those other ways would probably be like big infrastructure programs programs that looked really pretty, but were probably built on the death of the backs of migrants as well. So I think the politics thing just isn't as big as they tell you about. I think finally, those sports stuff is really important here. Can you just think, like, the US gets a massive injection economically every 4 years, say, for the Olympic Games, because it is the type of Western country. Surely that means the US has then the most money to develop their sports program to make sure that they have the ability to win these games again and again. That means that they're obviously dominant, and a lot of countries are likely to pull out from these. I think these games probably just collapse in 20 years at the point at which countries feel like they're hard done by, particularly countries like China and Russia, which would bring a lot of the developing world with them. Jordyn impacts this in her speech. I don't think I need to do it again, but because they tell you it's important, you should believe it is as well. At the end of this, so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the third negative for that speech and welcome the neg reply.
The scale of benefit we can claim in this debate is actually enormous, because the reforms brought to the kafala system in Qatar are the only reforms that have ever occurred in that system over the last 70 years, where people have been used and exploited to build these Gulf cities from the ground up on massive numbers on a massive scale. And in the future, that infrastructure construction will continue. We explained that it will, because these states have to be able to diversify away from oil. They need to be able to attract things like tourists and international acclaim. And that means that these reforms spread out into the future, as well as mattering in the immediate term. If this opposition team cares about human rights, weigh off the fact that but for things like this, you would not get these once in 70-year reforms, and these systems would stretch on for possibly a very long time into the future, because you would not get the unique draw of Western attention and Western pressure that these sports actually bring to these countries. That attention just did not occur when any of the other infrastructure projects in the Middle East were built, but it occurred this time because we proved to you that sports is a unique way of getting that attention. But the last thing to talk about in terms of human rights is even the material that they give you in the West is just uncomparative, because it is so much worse when you cement these things in one city. I explained to you that that means that that city becomes a monarch city. It becomes the only public-facing bit of that country, and it sucks resources away from comparatively far more disprivileged areas of that country and does so into the future with no potential end date. That is horrible for everyone who does not have the privilege within these areas to live within these cities that become the seat of some sort of large international sporting arena. It is tremendously unfair. Let's then talk briefly about economics. This team, I think, runs, again, a bunch of reasons as to why these are expensive things, why these are things that countries need to take on debt to achieve. But we give you mechanistic reasons why the countries that bid to host them are countries that are already prepared to embark on a large infrastructure spend, because they need to do so in order to get things like tourism or in order to diversify their economies. That suggests that probably that spend and that debt is symmetric. But we explained that the Olympics allow you to actually pay that down, because it allows you to attract tourists over the next 5 years, and the revenue that you get from them, whether it is through things like taxation that you get from them as they spend, whether they're spending in Western-owned businesses, whether they're spending locally, allows these governments to pay that back. That mattered tremendously, because countries understood that sport was a way to uniquely get that Western attention, which is why they did it for the positive of economics, and they were brought along for the ride on the human rights reforms we explained to you down the bench. The last thing I'm going to talk to you about, though, is the benefits of international sport and the way that this team throws that away, because we explained to you that entrenching these World Cup games or these Olympics in a particular area or a particular region of the world is something then that those countries can use to beat back the disprivileged people who want to be able to use these games as a way of establishing national pride and identity, of having something to rally around, and of having a symbol of unity. That was incredibly sad, and it meant that you lost a lot of the good things that international sport does right now. The cross-country teams, the diplomatic presences, all of that goes away at the point where sport becomes something that the West uses, or that the wealthy areas that do not happen to be in the West use to hurt the less wealthy, the less stable, the less privileged. This team mitigates this at best by suggesting that somehow people in desperately poor contexts can prepare for like Los Angeles conditions. Maybe they can do it a little bit. They will not be able to do it as well as the people that actually live within this country and can have consistent access to these facilities and get to know things like the conditions on the ground. That was not enough for them. And it does not respond to the material we give you, but how this becomes a unique source of funding for the sport that again means that the countries that get this privilege just magnify that privilege over time, just stop anyone else from winning these games. That is unbelievably sad. It deprives the associations of the opportunity to grow their sports. It deprives local activists of an international platform and international attention that they only are able to get often when these sports come to their region or come to their city. That is unbelievably sad. And I think that the benefits that they give you are comparatively speculative at best.
I'd like to thank the negative reply and welcome up the affirmative reply to close today's debate.
All right. I'm going to ask 2 questions in this reply. I'm going to ask firstly why countries make these choices. They seem to think we only have one reason. We have at least 5. Second, I'm going to ask whether it's worth it because the main path to victory for this team seems to very smugly characterize international sporting events as a traveling circus of human rights abuse resolution. They point to a once in a 70-year example that seems to suggest that this does not happen very often by their own analysis. But let's firstly ask why these countries make these choices in the first place, because they kind of rely on logic pretty circular here of like, well, if bad, countries won't make their choice to do it, therefore can't be bad. But we give you loads of reasons why these countries still do it. But I note as an observation at the start of this that obviously the people that we're talking about it being bad for are like people on the ground, right? Like it isn't necessarily bad for that one despot, but it is bad for everybody who gets displaced in that country. It is bad for everyone whose body gets dumped 12 miles outside of the stadium, outside of where the stadium was built. It is bad for all of those people. So what are the 5 reasons we give you at Aleisha? The first is just very simple cognitive bias of arrogance. It won't happen to me. This is one mechanism, pretty low-hanging fruit one by our own admission. That is why they latch onto it. It's because they can't deal with the other 4. But second one though is pointing to, including the organizations themselves, pointing to a set of hand-picked examples where it worked out okay. Note that okay means breaking even, like in Sydney and in London, but Sydney and London have already hosted it. So like, then what? Who does it next? And the answer is like Rio de Janeiro. The answer is like Beijing. And it ended horribly in both of those instances. Those facilities are abandoned. People were abused and little changed in those scenarios, as we tell you down the bench and then again at Bennett. But thirdly, we tell you that the harms of hosting are often difficult to measure when you are making that choice and difficult to quantify. Like what is the actuarial harm? What is the dollar amount of a person who is displaced permanently from their home? What is the dollar amount of somebody who has experienced abuse at the hands of police who were directed to clean up the city's image, to clean them up, to sweep them away, to conduct the way that this team tries to conduct vibe control this way, conduct image control of that country. Fourthly, we tell you that there's an enormous amount of prestige. There are 3 kinds. There's prestige for your political opposition, which is how it happened in Brazil. There's prestige with domestic legitimacy and within your own population. And there's international rebranding and prestige. And these guys seem to think that international rebranding, prestige, and legitimacy, these guys seem to think that, well, nobody thinks Qatar's legitimate because nobody's saying, I love Qatar right now. But people still went. People are still there right now. And that is its own form of legitimacy. It is accepting that you have to deal with that state as a legitimate entity. You have to cooperate with their rules and you have to play on their terms. And people have done that. That is legitimacy itself. That is what we tell you. Fifth and final reason, though, is that there's often enormous pressure from the organizations themselves, which often leads to misrepresenting what the harms actually are, because there is a norm that it rotates all the time. And they're constantly running out of feasible posts that leads to a series of unsuitable bids. Again, all material we give you at Aleisha, all material this team tries to smugly dismiss. We tell you that this is bad for people. It kills them, it displaces them, it wastes enormous amounts of money that could have been spent literally any other way to improve their well-being, and it has an enormous environmental harm. These guys say we don't quantify what environmental or climate harm is. Do we live in an environment? Do we live in a climate? Yeah, that's the harm. Like, it's climate change. It is also local environmental pollution. Terrible to deal with when you're living on the ground. Terrible for your sanitation. Terrible for your water quality. Second question, and finally, I'll ask, is it worth it? It's an enormous amount of this team's responses is just like, well, life is a bit bad in the Philippines anyway. Yeah, but obviously when you trade off against the benefits that they get, which are largely just the traveling circus example that I give you there, of a once in a 70-year benefit, of a ultimately a very minor reform that is probably going to be rolled back the second that eyes are taken off of this issue, because the country did not restructure its economy for this one-time influx of demand, this one-time influx of criticism. It will likely go back. But secondly, just like the fairness of sport, come on. Like, we mitigate this at Bennett, we give you substantial response, but like, please, I beg you, just weigh that up against the loss of human life, the loss of quality of life that arises when you treat people as disposable and you treat cities like dumps that you can do whatever you want to, leave them with dilapidated buildings and fucked up transportation and infrastructure that was never designed for them in the first place. Obviously, affirm.
Okay, guys, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start out with one general piece of feedback, then I'll give you guys the result, then I'll explain how I came to the result. So the general piece of feedback that I have for this debate is essentially that this is one of those debates where, depending on the situation that we are talking about, the outcome of the debate varies really wildly, right? So depending on whether under the negative world, these events are being hosted in Qatar or they're being hosted in London, obviously the outcome looks quite different. And I think what that means is a more significant portion of the analysis in the debate has to be devoted to that kind of analysis. Just numerically, how much of the time are we talking about column A and how much of the time are we talking about column B? So in this debate in particular, I think it looks more like spending a pretty significant portion of the speech talking about the bids process in the status quo and who typically those bids are awarded to. And in the circumstances that they're awarded in column A, why does it benefit your case? Why is it the case that column A is awarded the majority of the time? Because ultimately, this debate does come down to situations where I think both teams can pretty reasonably point out that there are situations where it clearly makes more sense in one world and it clearly makes more sense in the other world. So sometimes just that numbers weighing really helps me break up the debate. All right, let me get into the decision and how I came to that decision. I gave this debate to the affirmative team. It was a split decision. I was in the majority. I thought there were three broad issues in this debate. The first was on economics and other associated harms related to the development of infrastructure. The second was of human rights abuses and other kind of negative behavior that we expect from some bad governments. And the third is on sports and what's best for the sporting arena. So first on economics. The first thing I want to do is just a little bit dive into the framing of the debate. So as the negative team point out, it is very likely that in the affirmative team's world, we're predominantly talking about these permanent host countries being Western countries, or rather countries that are characterized by being particularly stable and particularly wealthy, as the affirmative team recharacterize it. Broadly, this isn't too contentious in the debate. I do concede that there is some material from the negative team that goes to suggest that it will sometimes be held in non-Western countries that are also relatively wealthy and stable. But broadly, I think this is the characterization. So when there are permanent host countries, those permanent host countries are likely to be these big, powerful countries. By comparison, what material do we hear about what the kind of countries in the status quo look like? What kind of countries are they on the whole? So I think we hear quite a lot of material about the decision-making process, but less material on the kinds of countries that they're likely to be. I think some of the good material we hear from the affirmative, however, suggests that countries with limited democratic oversight typically win these bids more than one might expect. And that is for the reason that they are some of the only countries that are willing to take out the massive loans required to get the money in order to build the infrastructure to host these particular events, which means that at least more than you would expect from a totally random distribution of countries, you're likely to see those kinds of countries being represented. That's going to be important for some later analysis, that piece of framing. So let's dive in and talk about, are countries benefited economically when they host without being a permanent host country? The first thing that we hear from the negative team is that essentially there are a set of benefits to being able to host these events that just really provide a lot of jobs, they provide a lot of infrastructure. Let's jump into it. So the first one they provide is tourism, and they essentially explain that you drive a lot of touristic interest into these countries, which provides quite a lot of stimulus to these countries, which in turn generates a lot of jobs. And then that not only provides a short-term benefit, but into the long term, it also provides benefits by raising the awareness of these countries on the global stage and creating a bit of an industry around that tourism. They secondly explain that it leads to a lot of short-term employment. And that kind of short-term employment that you see is the kind of short-term employment that also skills people up to transfer into similar industries or similar roles into the future. And the third thing they explain is that the infrastructure that is built by these particular events will often, A, cause a lot of spending in the short term, which can be beneficial, but also into the long term can be reused for other things, whether that be very directly, like, for example, a sports stadium being reused for another sporting event into the future, or things like a big road being built as necessitated by the sporting event, but then having more generalized application later on. At the end of that analysis by the negative team, I'm willing to accept prima facie that these events do cause substantial economic benefits in a series of ways. So the question then for the affirmative team is, are they able to outweigh these, or are they able to mitigate them to the point where they're able to outweigh them? What does the affirmative team say? The first thing they say on tourism is that these benefits are typically centralized in wealthier areas, and that the tourists typically don't actually transfer that wealth particularly well. I think ultimately this works as a piece of minor mitigation, but I think without the affirmative team explaining to me why wealthy areas are, all of a sudden a harm or are in some way not deserving of that economic benefit, it's hard for me to weigh that response too heavily into the debate. Next, on employment, they say similar things about wealthy people, and my previous comment applies there. But I think their stronger response is to point out that the jobs are typically more temporary than the negative team are characterizing them to be, and that for the most part, the skills aren't directly transferable. And where they are transferable, like in the building industry, in the worst cases, they can lead to a substantial amount of harm. And I'll delve into that harm later, but I think essentially this acts as an effective piece of mitigation on the employment front. Finally, on infrastructure, I think this is where the affirmative team make the most ground, because what the affirmative team are able to explain is that for the most part, the kind of infrastructure we're talking about is less transferable than it would be otherwise. For instance, a sports stadium clearly has less generalized application to a city in its day-to-day use than spending that money on, for example, a bridge. The negative team respond by suggesting that, well, actually, these countries are the kind of countries that would be prone to spending money on infrastructure development anyway. So it's not like there's a big comparative harm. But I think what the affirmative team are able to point out is that there is still a pretty substantial opportunity cost, because if they were willing to spend that money as the negative team characterizes, then the affirmative team's harm is even larger, because it means that money is not otherwise going to the kinds of infrastructure that would have more long-term transferability for that country and benefit them more economically. Given that I viewed infrastructure as the most, probably the biggest economic benefit or harm in this larger issue, I thought that ultimately the affirmative team were able to demonstrate that on net, it's likely that these countries would be spending this money in more economically productive ways into the long term. And for that reason, I think very narrowly on that, they're able to get ahead. Where I think they're able to get a little bit further ahead is by pointing out that a lot of the time, the kinds of benefits that do accrue in the negative team's worlds also come at other kinds of costs, whether that be costs to, for instance, people's lives in the process of building, whether that be costs to the local environment, or whether that be costs to, just for example, senses of, national unity through massive displacements of people and things like that. And all of those things naturally do feed into economic harms, but they also feed into a variety of practical harms. The negative team's primary response here is to point out that those kinds of things still happen when you have a country building once. But I think the third affirmative puts it pretty well, which is essentially that in the affirmative team's world, the benefit they get is able to be repeated again and again, while the harm they get is typically only copped once, which is to say that a lot of the harms, I think the negative are right, might happen to some extent into the future, but are much less likely to happen again and again and again into the future in the way that it would if it's constantly cycling around different cities. So broadly for the reason of opportunity cost, and also for the reason that I think that they're able to get the benefit repeatedly while only paying the cost once, I think the affirmative team narrowly get ahead on the economic issue, which for the reasons I will go on to detail, I think ultimately ends up being the most substantial issue in the debate. The reason for that is essentially that I think the affirmative team are able to point out, as per the framing that I provided earlier, that the absolute worst excesses of the harms that they're talking about only happen in the negative team's world. And I think the negative team are correct in pointing out a series of mitigations to demonstrate that they're unlikely to happen at the frequency the affirmative team suggests. For example, the fact that a lot of the time governments are really well informed and there's strong consensus to push back against the kinds of biases that they might otherwise have or electoral pressures to host these events. But I think where the affirmative team are able to pull ahead is by pointing out that sometimes it is the case that these worst excesses will occur. And as per the negative team's own characterization, it will just functionally never happen in the affirmative team's world, where it's being hosted in very stable, very wealthy countries. So on that issue, I think the affirmative team get ahead. Let's dive into the next two issues. The next issue is on human rights abuses. I think ultimately the negative team are able to win this issue. Why do I think the negative team are able to win this issue? Essentially because I think what they're able to demonstrate is that on aggregate, the amount of harm generated by these countries is likely to go down at the point where there are not only more eyes on what they're doing, leading to more international pressure on them, but also more interest from actors who would otherwise not want those human rights abuses to continue invested in those countries, which makes those countries preemptively likely to stop those human rights abuses so that they can win the bid or so that they can attract investment, or it's likely to stop it into the future as ties continue to integrate. And I think the ultimate punchline of that material is such that I'm willing to believe that some of the worst countries that host these events get a bit better into the future. Why is this not able to ultimately come up over the previous issue? Why do I think it can't win the negative team debate? I think for two reasons. I think the first reason is that I think it lacks some of the mechanistic rigor and the intuition that the previous issue has, which is to say that a lot of the harms that the negative team are talking about are kinds of harms that I'm willing to believe and that I think are proved to sufficient extent, but not proved to the extent where I'm willing to believe it happens at a frequency enough to outweigh the aggregate economic harm that happens in almost all circumstances as the affirmative team are able to prove. But I think the second reason is that I think the affirmative team are able to do enough mitigation to point out that at least in some circumstances, it also leads to some further human rights abuses, which is to say, A, as I point out, I think the affirmative team are able to point to examples where the actual development of this infrastructure has led to human rights abuses. I think this could have been mechanized better, but I concede that it has happened in the past and therefore may happen in the future. And B, I think they're able to point out that the legitimacy granted to these countries to some extent allows them to obfuscate the kinds of harms happening. Ultimately, however, I do think the negative team do win this issue and that on net, human rights abuses are minimized on their side of the house. Finally, on sports issues, I think the negative team also win this by demonstrating that it's likely the perception of sport would be more fair in the negative team's world because you would eliminate home country bias and you're more likely to have people invested in sports when it's consistently being hosted in new places, leading to new fan bases. However, I just think, put simply, because it's always going quite long, I don't think this material ends up being impactful enough relative to the other issues in this debate. And I think more work needed to be done to demonstrate the scale of impact that the negative team was claiming in order for it to end up weighing heavily into my decision. So that's why the debate ultimately ends up falling to the affirmative team. It was a very high quality debate. Thank you all very much.